audio test and then we can...
Okay. Does anyone here have any fruits in particular they're really excited to learn about? Just kind of general knowledge today? Grapes? Raspberries? Cool. Blueberries. Okay, cool. Yeah, we'll talk about all of them. I'm going to talk about some stuff that a lot of you may not heard of too, because there's all kinds of edible plants, edible fruits you can grow that you won't find in a grocery store. Currants, yeah. I've got some currants up here. We'll talk about that.
Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. We're definitely expecting a few more people, so maybe they'll trickle in as we go on. But I'll let James introduce himself. So that we do about the lecture portion, and then the last half hour for Q&A. But like you said, if it's just kind of a short little thing, go on ahead, and we like to have a discussion. So on to you,
okay.
James.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm James. I've been at Glover for about 3 years. I work in the diagnostic department inside. You'll often find me, helping people with issues they've got with their plants or suggest on what to plant and whatnot. I've got a degree in horticulture from Utah State University, and I'm also an ISA certified arborist, which isn't necessarily relevant to this class, but I am qualified to talk about this stuff, just in case you're wondering. Like Emily said, if there are general questions or short questions, feel free to talk about them during the class. If it's really specific, let's wait for the question portion of the class, just to make sure we're making efficient use of our time. So one thing I want to talk about, first off, what is a fruit? Does anyone have a definition of fruit that they like, that they want to share? They have seeds inside, yeah? That's a really good one. Honestly, that might be one of the best short ones I've heard. Yeah, seeds inside. So, for the purpose of this class, the fruits that we're going to discuss are the perennial, sometimes woody, sometimes herbaceous fruits that you can grow in Utah. So melons, that sort of thing, even though they're sweet and juicy and we consider them a fruit, and they are, for the scope of this class, they're going to be considered more on the vegetable side of things. After the class, I'm happy to talk about them if you got questions, but we're not going to talk about any annual fruits. This is going to be perennial stuff, and what are pretty much all woody, and then the exception are strawberries, because they're a perennial herbaceous plant. So the culinary definition of fruit includes all the sweet stuff, right? Nothing really savory. Are tomatoes a fruit? What do people think? Yes, kinda. Technically, they are fruit. There's the botanical definition of a fruit and the culinary definition of a fruit don't match up, really. Botanically speaking, things with seeds in them is a great way to say it. It's the fruiting structure, the reproductive fruiting structure of a plant. And almost always, unless it's been bred out, they contain viable seeds. So that's how the plant's going to reproduce year after year. That can include a bunch of different stuff. You've got different kinds of berries. You can have dry fruited things like the seeds of a maple or an oak. Those are fruits, even though we don't really consider them as such. Tomatoes, I don't know if anyone knows this. Technically they're a fruit, but we usually consider them a vegetable, right? That's because in 1890 in the US, they were considered a fruit, and as such, the growers did not have to pay import tariffs. There was a Supreme Court case where, I can't remember, some senator from the Midwest basically said, well, since we eat it for dinner, not for dessert, it's not a fruit. So since then, a legal definition, tomatoes are considered a vegetable, even though they really are a type of berry, botanically speaking. So I thought that was a funny little bit of history. But yeah, for this class, it's going to be woody plants, the herbaceous stuff, some vines. I didn't bring the grapes up, but you'll know what grapes are. The most important thing is where are you going to plant and what do you want to grow? So most of your common fruits you get in a grocery store, you can grow with varying degrees of success in Utah. Barring any of the tropical stuff, of course. not every plant is going to want to grow in the same place. So most of these that I've got up here, most of what you'll find at the nursery are going to be kind of a full to partial sun, moderate moisture, relatively rich soil. There are some exceptions, like grapes can tolerate pretty dry conditions. Some of the native fruits we have in Utah can tolerate pretty dry conditions. Some of them, like blueberries, which we'll discuss more in depth, are a little harder to grow in your average Utah yard, at least in the Wasatch Front, because they like really acidic conditions, really moist conditions, which most people just don't really have, right? So, on the back of your handout, we've made a little table as well for what sort of plant you've got and what generally it requires. For the Wasatch Front, you're not really too limited. Again, aside from blueberries, you can grow all kinds of stuff: currants, grapes, raspberries, blackberries, honeyberries, which we'll talk about. Some of you may or may not be familiar with. There are a few things that you can grow here that are technically a little bit borderline. Pomegranates. I don't know if anyone knows you can grow those here technically, but it's a little iffy because there is zone 7. Is there anyone that's not familiar with USDA zones? Okay, yeah, there is zone 7, which is a little iffy. Same idea with figs. You can do it, but it's not always going to be super reliable. But generally, this stuff is all going to be, you can plant it in your average yard pretty successfully. You're going to want to expect some degree of maintenance. You can plant any of these and have a nice shrub that, as long as you water, you'll get some fruit out of. But by default, it's not going to be the highest quality. You're not going to have a really great quantity of fruit. And you may not get fruit successfully every year, and you might have issues with pests and diseases. So if you want fruit, especially if you want a decent yield, expect some degree of maintenance. I'm sure you all are expecting that, but there are some things that you can plant that just looks nice and you can occasionally get some fruit out of, like like this Nanking cherry here, or service berries. They're beautiful ornamental plants in their own right, but if the goal is fruit production, there's going to be a decent degree of maintenance involved. Sometimes that's really hands-on. Sometimes it's cutting it once a year. So expect some degree of maintenance, right? And a third point I don't want to make that not everybody wants to hear is plan to share. You're never going to get 100% of your crop, nor should you expect it, frankly, unless you're growing commercially and your livelihood depends upon it. Even then, commercial growers aren't getting 100%. So keep in mind that there are lots of critters that are going to want to have some fruit, whether it's birds, insects, maybe your neighbors are reaching over the fence and grabbing something. It's okay to share it. These plants are generous, so you can be a little generous too. A small amount of crop loss is totally normal. We're not going to talk about too many pests in depth in this class. If you have questions about them afterward, I'm happy to talk about it, or of course in the diagnostics desk we can talk about it. But there are many plants that, as long as they're generally healthy, can tolerate a small infestation or infection without it affecting yield significantly. If the goal is to grow fruit and get a decent yield, you need to balance two main factors when you're pruning. There's your vegetative growth, so your leafy stuff. This is how the plant gathers energy, so it's a source. And then you have your reproductive growth, your flowers and your fruits, and that's more of a sink. It's kind of a balancing act, because of course you want to get a good amount of fruit off your plants. You need to prune so that that fruit can ripen properly, be free from disease. So it's kind of a trade-off whenever you're pruning, and you're going to want to keep that in mind. For anyone who was in my fruit tree class last week, if you are pruning, one thing to keep in mind is step back and look at it. It's tempting to just, all right, I'm just going to do all this, 10 minutes, we're done. It's really easy to over prune. It's easy to take off too much, or maybe you don't notice something at first that you need to come back and check on later. But stepping back to evaluate often is something that's really crucial. Even leaving it for sleep on it overnight. Cut off a few branches and check it out the next day, because you might notice something different. I think it's really, really easy to in the heat of the moment do too much. So for proper shape and structure, and to make sure you're pruning off the correct amount, slow down. Does anyone have any questions so far? Okay. As far as deciding what to plant, you've kind of got a few categories here that we'll talk about. You've got your shrubby things. So that's going to be currants and gooseberries. They're really closely related. Blueberries, honeyberries, elderberries, serviceberries. Some of the bushier fruits like the bush cherries, like this Nanking cherry, I put in the shrub category. Something like a goji berry is kind of in between shrub and vine, but for the sake of the class, we're going to categorize things pretty broadly into shrubs, vines, and herbaceous plants and brambles as well. So when you're pruning a shrub, if you, of course, you buy something like this, you may not need to prune right away. It's already a pretty good shape. Maybe it's not old enough to really produce. You kind of just let them do their thing. Once it starts producing and you've got a more established plant, generally your pruning is going to be thinning and cutting back for size. So if I had something like this currant here, and it could be 6 feet tall and wide, you're going to get a lot of fruit. That might be kind of hard to reach in the middle to actually harvest. So some of the pruning you're going to do is just for ease of harvesting what's in there. Thinning it is taking out some of the older branches, generally down to the base. So, I don't really have a great old example to show you. We can use this for the sake of it. If I were just cutting this back every year to predetermined height, 3-4 feet, whatever, eventually, because when you prune, you're just redirecting energy, right? You're not stunting it. Eventually, you're going to get these dense kind of knots on the end. You see that a lot with plants that are hedged regularly. If you cut back into that where it's got those big knots, it can look kind of bare, look kind of ugly, aesthetically pleasing, not very aesthetically pleasing. It also can be difficult to maintain that for proper fruit production. So cutting it back is important, but you also want to thin out. So maybe I'd take out, this very center branch to open things up a little bit, get more light in there. Again, for those who are in my fruit tree class, there's some overlap with the fruit trees. The structure is not as important, but it's something to keep in mind. So you're cutting things back to the base where they can send up some new growth. Usually when you're doing thinning, you don't want to take off more than 1/3 of the plant at a time. That's kind of a rule of thumb. There are always exceptions. Sometimes you need to cut something in half. That's fine. But generally 1/3 is a pretty good rule of thumb where you're not going to affect the yield significantly that year. When you do that, it's called rejuvenation pruning or reinvigoration pruning, because you're promoting a lot of new growth from the base. And if you do, let's say, 1/3 every year, depending on what species it is, maybe every other year, eventually you're going to end up with pretty much a brand new shrub. All the time I hear people say, it's too big and old, I'm just taking it out and planting a new one. You can pretty much always reinvigorate what you've got, even if it's a big gnarly thing. You move into a house that has a huge patch of blackberries, there's a way to save that. You don't have to replace it outright, right? For the most part, with your shrubs, you're going to be getting fruit on either brand new wood or on 1-year-old wood, depending on the species. Something like a honeyberry, sorry, you can see that's even blooming right now. It's got a few flowers on it. That's on older growth, right? It produces vegetative growth and reproductive growth at right about the same time. So when you're pruning something like a honeyberry, you want to make sure you're maintaining a decent amount of that 1-year-old wood in order to get production. So that's why timing matters too. If I were to cut this back in early spring, you can still get some yield out of where it's going to bud out from the base. But if you're pruning it back, right after it blooms, you're going to have a better harvest generally. For most plants, pruning after they bloom is a pretty good idea if you're not sure. You can get more specific with the timing, but pruning just after bloom is a pretty good time to do it.
James, I'm not understanding the old growth and the new growth. exactly. So when you're pruning, the vegetative
Mm-hmm.
is you prune more of that, or you prune the reproductive more, or I don't quite understand.
Did everybody hear that question? Just wanting clarification on when you're pruning, what to prune, especially when it relates to 1 or 2 year old wood, right? That's kind of what you're asking. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, it's always going to be a bit of a balancing act because if you do need to cut it back, and again, keep in mind this is if you need to prune, you really there's not many plants you have to prune just as a matter of maintenance. It's if the plant requires it for fruit production or for health. You kind of want to balance out what you're cutting. So, which one's flowering here? Yeah. So the honeyberry, you see, has some blossoms on the end. Um, when you're cutting, you just want to make sure you're maintaining enough of the buds that can fruit. So that's I haven't explained it too well on the honeyberry, but we'll talk about it on some of the others. If you're pruning anything that will produce buds that will fruit, let's say you're doing it in fall or spring, you're going to affect your yield for that year. So that's where you want to make sure you're maintaining the structures that can fruit, those buds that can fruit year from year. And we'll get into it more too. Yeah.
Can you just turn that other mic up a little bit? Just sometimes with the flapping.
Can't hear it. This is as loud as it goes.
Okay, all right.
Hopefully everyone can hear me. So yeah, what you're cutting off, keep in mind you can affect yield depending on where you're pruning and when you're pruning, and it varies from plant to plant. When you're pruning, you've kind of got the goal of again balancing the vegetative and reproductive growth, shaping, size, pruning out to have good airflow, like with fruit trees, really will also really help with disease prevention. There are many fungal diseases that really like to have a pretty stagnant, protected environment. So in the middle of a really dense shrub, you can have a greater proliferation of fungal issues. Whereas if you're opening things up, getting more airflow, sunlight, you're getting more energy for the plant, you get better yield. That can also minimize pest and disease pressure. So just as a matter of preventative care for a lot of the issues you can run into, having a pretty open shrub, again, this is applying to shrubs, can really help with fruit production and minimizing the need to use any chemicals or specific pesticides, right? So we can talk a little bit more specifically about currants and gooseberries. I think there's somebody here that mentioned they want to learn about those more specifically. They're very closely related. They're in the same genus Ribes, along with Yosta berries, which we sometimes carry. That's a hybrid between the two, between a black currant and a gooseberry. They are generally, I don't have any gooseberries to show, they can be kind of thorny. I don't know if anyone's seen gooseberries. They can have thorns on them that are about this long, so they can be pretty vicious. A lot of the ones that we carry have been bred to not be as thorny or be totally thornless. So keep in mind, you can always find them that are a little more friendly. Currants, on the other hand, I've got a red lake currant and a black currant here. They're totally thornless, as you can see. They produce fruit in clusters, generally around kind of mid to late summer. So this is a really good, I don't know if anyone's ever had currants here. They're not as common in North America. You see them a lot more in Europe or back east as well compared to out west. Off the plant, they have a pretty strong flavor. It's generally really tangy and tart. They're often processed into jams and jellies. Even though they're not super well known, I think they are one of the easiest shrubs to grow successfully in our climate. You really don't need to do a ton of maintenance. Occasionally, they can get a couple different fungal issues, but rarely is it so significant that yield is impacted. So if you're not sure what to plant, especially if you haven't tried them, currants and gooseberries are a great choice because for the most part, they're pretty hands off. There's actually quite a few native species in Utah. I don't have any right now, but over in the native section, we often have golden currants. I don't know if anyone's had those either. They're gorgeous plants, yellow blooms. They smell really like cinnamony, the flowers. The fruit's delicious. It is one of the few really like just off the bat tasty native plants that you can cultivate really, really easily because they can tolerate pretty substantial drought. So if you have a dry area you maybe don't want to maintain super heavily, something like a golden currant's a pretty good choice because you'll get good yield even if you're not maintaining it or watering it regularly. And again, really, really pretty. It's got these golden flowers that smell kind of like cinnamon cloves. They're really nice. They really don't have too many pest and disease issues. Again, sometimes fungal issues, but pruning can take care of that. They also can fruit pretty well in shade. So if you have a shady spot, they're not a bad choice. You get better yield with more sun, of course, but there's really not too many fruits that you can grow successfully in a really shady area. So currants are a good choice. Gooseberries do okay in shade as well, but they take a lot longer to ripen. They're also quite cold hardy, so even if you're up in Park City, Heber, gooseberries and currants are a good choice. Elderberries, that's one that a lot of people know of for their medicinal value. They have all sorts of compounds in them that are excellent for colds and other respiratory issues. As an edible plant, though, they're really good too. Again, maybe not as common in this area, much more common in Europe or back east, but they are incredibly productive. They are another hands-off, pretty low-maintenance shrub if you've got the room for them. Elderberries can be 15 feet tall. They can be huge.
Allow them to get that tall. I know. What if they start hanging over? Does that mean we should just cut them so they aren't drooping?
I mean, if you've got the space, the drooping's okay too. Honestly, it can make it a little easier to harvest in some cases, but you don't have to let them get that tall. You can keep them cut way back and still get successful fruit because that is one of the ones that blooms and fruits on new wood. So something like this, you might be able to see, this has been cut back. This was overwintered here. There's tons of shoots coming out of the base. These could easily grow 3 or 4 feet tall this season and flower and fruit. So you don't have to let them get huge. If you got the room, you can have a ton of yield. You don't mind, getting on a ladder or letting the birds do it for you. But they are the sort of thing that you can prune really, really heavily without worrying about affecting production. Usually I would do it right about now when they're beginning to wake up. You could do it pre-winter as well. Elderberry is kind of brittle, so if it's in an area with a lot of heavy snowfall, like in the corner of your house, it's maybe going to get dumped on. Just for preventing breakage, you could prune it before winter as well. Again, since it fruits on new wood, the timing doesn't matter too much. As long as you're not doing it like right prior to blooming, because then you might affect your crop that year. But right now it's a great time. With elderberries, generally you need 2 plants for yield. This is something some of the others, they have this characteristic as well. They need pollinization, not pollination where there's a bee flying from one flower to another. Pollinization, which is, distinct genetic material from another plant in the same species, pollen generally, going to this plant. So this is Adams. This is a popular black elderberry that's been bred for fruit production. In order to get a yield, you would need something like York, or Nova, I think works pretty well. We can talk more about the particulars after the class, but generally you need 2 different plants for pollinization. Keep in mind that many of the ornamental elderberries do produce fruit as well. You can use those. I haven't seen research on this. Anecdotally, I've used those for pollinization, and it works pretty well. So if you don't have space for 2 fruiting shrubs, maybe you have an ornamental one somewhere in your front yard. You could use that, as long as it's the same species. So this is a black elderberry. You'll also find red elderberries in cultivation and blue, which is one of the native ones. So just keep in mind, it has to be the same species, but a different variety. Like I mentioned, elderberries, tough as nails. They can do wet or dry, sun or shade, a variety of elevations. They're really not picky about soil. They produce very, very heavily. Birds also love them too. So if you want to harvest a decent amount, you could consider netting or protecting it in other ways. Does anyone have any questions about elderberries? There's actually a good chunk of ornamental plants that I'll talk about kind of at the end of these fruiting ones that are really pretty but also give you some good yield. Like, just for an example, something like the sand cherry right here. I don't know if anyone's ever had sand cherries. Gorgeous plant, amazing blooms, fantastic fall color, incredibly tough. We have some planted on, like, basically on the asphalt in the parking lot, and they're completely fine. They also produce delicious cherries. So this is a sand cherry. Yeah. And again, once I go through the kind of regular cast, I'll talk about some of the more ornamental but edible stuff because there's a lot of them. There's some really, really good ones that I think folks ought to know about. So yeah, there's elderberries. They really don't have any pest or disease issues. So you can really, really easily grow those. Blueberries are one we're going to talk about now. If anyone's done gardening in Utah for a while, they'll know blueberries are kind of infamous for being difficult to grow here successfully. Blueberries in their natural habitat, they're native to most of the northern hemisphere, both here and in Europe and Asia. They grow in either really high latitude areas, so Canada, Northern Europe, or high elevation. So, for example, there's some blueberry relatives you'll find up in the Uintas at above 8,000 feet. They like those conditions because generally when you get to high elevation or high latitude, you've got, not always, but generally, you tend to have more acidic soil because forests are dominated by conifer species as opposed to more lowland deciduous species. The soil can often remain inundated with water for much of the year because the growing season is so short. Maine, for example, is probably the biggest producer of blueberries in the country, along with, I think, like Minnesota or Michigan. Some of those places all have in common is it's really cold and the soil is much more acidic, much more moist, and therefore generally much more fertile as well. Utah, at least if you're along the Wasatch Front, infertile, super alkaline. Growing season's pretty long. It's hot. It's dry. It's doable to grow them in the ground, but generally you can alter the pH, that's the acidity alkalinity balance, much more successfully if you grow it in a pot or a raised bed, because then you've got a totally artificial environment. If you grow something like a blueberry in the ground, even if you add in acidic soil, it's really hard to make a long-term permanent impact on your pH. It lasts for 6 months to a year, depending on how quickly your soil decomposes the stuff you add in. But generally, growing it in a bed or a pot is a lot easier to successfully keep the pH low. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that we also have high water pH. So no matter what you add into the soil, you have to work around the fact that your water is also going to be 8.5. There really aren't too many blueberries grown commercially in Utah, but there are some farmers up in Logan who do it, and they use a sulfur burner. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of those. Kind of a specialized piece of equipment that adds sulfur into the water, and sulfur lowers the pH. So if you can make your water acidic, or at the very least neutral, your soil additives, whether it's acidic compost or acidic fertilizer, is going to last a lot longer, and you're going to be more successful. So it's kind of an uphill battle. I mentioned earlier in the class, unless you really, really want homegrown blueberries, that is one of the ones that might be easier just buy at the grocery store. But as an ornamental plant, let's say you don't care too much about really, really keeping the pH low. As an ornamental plant, blueberries are gorgeous. You can see it's just getting ready to really fully bloom here. It's got awesome fall color. If you grow it and you don't get fruit, you still have a nice looking plant. So there's always some benefit to growing it yourself. They also do need pretty consistent moisture. So especially if you're growing in a pot or raised bed, keep in mind that in those conditions, since you raised it up out of the soil, you do need to water more just by default because you're not insulated by the earth around you. I will say that blueberries don't really have many pest or disease issues, which is nice. The trade-off is generally you have to deal with soil chemistry problems, water chemistry, abiotic stressors are the term we use. So I brought up a few. Am I still in frame over here? Can I move around a little bit? Okay. I brought up a few fertilizers as an example. You'll notice all of these ones from High Yield all have something to do with sulfur. That's the unifying factor. Sulfur is an element that generally lowers pH. So you can add in straight up soil sulfur. This changes pH and does nothing else. You can add in ammonium sulfate, which in addition to the sulfur also adds in ammonium, which is a really common form of nitrogen, which can help with vegetative growth. Or, and this is just an example, there's a bunch of sulfate products. There's something like iron sulfate, which also adds in iron. Anyone who's tried to grow blueberries, or there's a bunch of trees in Utah that tend to prefer, that people plant, not native, that tend to prefer lower pH conditions. You'll see chlorosis. That's the yellowy leaves. Some people think it looks kind of pretty, but it's a sign of sickness. So iron is the chemical that can more immediately correct that, because the difference in pH primarily causes iron deficiencies. It causes some other deficiencies too, but iron's the main one. So lowering the pH with sulfur or adding in iron directly can help to correct that. Depending on what your conditions are like, you may need to add these things in, a couple times a year, maybe once a year. All of these are synthetic and mineral salt based, so you want to water them in like immediately afterward, and maybe don't use ammonium sulfate in the heat of summer because you can burn your plants. There are some organic options as well that we've got inside. Since they're organic, they're a little bit harder to overdo. You can use those a little more safely, even when it's hot out. But keep in mind, it's something that you need to maintain constantly. It's not a, plant it, fertilize it once and forget it sort of thing. One thing I also want to mention too with the pH, you can get kits like this from us that test pH, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. These kind of just point you in the right direction. If you do need a really precise test, the Utah State Extension Service also has a soil testing lab that you can send soil samples to. So if you're not sure what you've got, you can use something like this for a rough idea, or you can contact Utah State for more specifics. Any other questions on that? Okay. As an alternative to blueberries, there are the honeyberries, which I mentioned earlier. I don't know if anyone's heard of those or had them. They are marketed as a blueberry alternative. The fruit looks kind of similar, tastes kind of similar. It's not related. I think you do them a bit of injustice if you just say they're an easier blueberry, because they're great in their own right. They've got a different flavor, hence the name honeyberry. They tend to be really quite sweet. They're not, depending on when you harvest at least, not quite as tart as blueberries. But the big thing is they're way easier to grow if you're going to use them as an alternative. They don't care about pH nearly as much. They don't really care about having super, super moist soil. Regular moisture is nice, but it doesn't have to be, consistently wet. Like some of the blueberry relatives that we have in Utah are in pretty boggy conditions, actually. They're similarly very cold hardy. Blueberries and honeyberries can both grow pretty much anywhere in Utah, even up in Logan or in the Wasatch Back. The thing about them, like some of the others, is they do need a pollinizer. So you need two separate plants that are compatible. So not every honeyberry is going to pollinate every other honeyberry. I brought up two. I mean, most of what we have right now is going to be interchangeable, but I brought up two that do work, like berry blue and borealis. They generally bloom around the same time, and they're not so closely related that they won't pollinize each other. But keep in mind, if you're going to grow honeyberries, you want to make sure they work together, because they may or may not. There's a few different, primarily universities that have bred them. University of Saskatchewan in Canada is kind of the main one. They're where these genetics come from. So pretty much everything that they've released will be compatible, but you can also get stuff that's been bred in Europe. They may or may not work together. So before you buy them, do your research. We've got some signage that's helpful, but ultimately you want to confirm, make sure what you've got will work. But honeyberries, way, way easier to grow by far. They also do tend to, you don't get fruit right away with these. I know these are blooming right now, but I'd be shocked if they really produced a significant yield. A thing that you plant and maybe give it a few years before expecting a decent harvest. All right. I mean, unless you're starting with a small one, you can get some fruit pretty quickly. Like a 5 gallon like this would produce fruit this year for sure. With, and I feel like you hear this more in the realm of fruit trees, with fruits, if you let them yield in their first year, you are affecting their establishment. So generally in the first season, even if it can produce fruit, it's not a bad idea to pull off a good chunk of that just to make sure it's putting its energy into rooting out and becoming established first.
So I bought a plant last week and it had a ton of little, and it was a fruit.
Mm-hmm.
It had a ton of little bulbs that haven't flowered.
Mm-hmm.
Should right now go through and pull off a lot of those?
I mean, it's up to you. It will produce. It will put more resources into rooting if you pull them off. But of course, part of the fun of buying plants is seeing how pretty they can be. So you could leave some of them on there just to enjoy it.
Some, but pull a lot of them off.
My personal philosophy, yes. You'd be fine if you didn't, though. You're not gonna kill your plant if you let it bloom from the get go. Establishment in Utah takes time anyway, so no matter what, you're kind of in it for the long haul. Let's talk a little bit about grapes. I didn't bring any up, but we have a ton of them right now. Grapes generally do really well in Utah, especially all of the American varieties. So like Concord, that's the one a lot of folks are familiar with for juicing and jelly and whatnot. Thompson, pretty similar. Flame, Niagara, Catawba, there's a ton of them. American grapes are generally quite well equipped to handle our weather and our soil. European grapes, like any wine grape, generally it's just a little too cold here to grow them successfully. You can get away with it if you've got a good microclimate, but maybe don't plan on growing like Merlot and Pinot Grigio and whatnot in your yard. It's kind of hard to do with our cold temperatures that we have here. There are some hybrids of American and European that you can grow very successfully, though. And there are some like Muscat or Muscadine grapes that you'd see more in the southeast. Again, it's a little too cold to grow here, but you can get away with it if you've got a good, more protected microclimate. With all of these, of course, it goes without saying, plant what you're going to want to eat. Sometimes people ask me, what grows well here? I mean, anything we carry, with the caveat of blueberries being a little more hands-on. But just plant what you're going to want to eat. So if you're growing grapes for jelly, do something like a Concord. If you're growing it just for fresh eating, maybe you're doing a Flame or Reliance. There's a lot of different varieties that I can talk about if you're more curious about the selection. But yeah, just grow what you're going to eat, of course, because then you're going to want to maintain it.
How much sunshine do grapes need?
The more the better, generally.
Can they do it in partial shade?
It might affect the yield if you have less than 8 hours of sun, but generally more is better. If you grow really any of these in shadier conditions, what it mostly affects is, because you're putting less energy into the plant, is how much fruit you can get and how long it's going to take to ripen. Because with lower resources, that's all going to be a little more stretched out. So if you don't really have a super sunny spot, give it a go. You'll still get some fruit, but you might harvest later than your neighbors would in a full sun area. You're not going to get as much. With grapes, the pruning's kind of unusual. Has anyone seen a vineyard in person or in pictures? What does it look like? Yeah, super bony. There's vineyards, winemakers cut it back to nothing basically each season. You can do that. I'll go into a couple different pruning styles to do that. That's a really good way to contain the harvest and still get a decent yield out of it. You can also let grapes grow huge. Like my grandparents had a vine that was probably 100 feet long in their backyard. And it was really messy and hard to harvest, but there was a ton of fruit each season. So again, it's kind of a balance of how much maintenance do you want to do. You don't always have to do it the way that the experts are saying that are growing it commercially, right? With grapes, the most important thing is keeping in mind that the buds are compound buds. So on a grape, you get a little bud on it, this big. That's where a stem, leaves, fruits, flowers, all come out of that each season. It's not a leaf here and there or a flower here and there. It's a compound bud. So you can have, you know, a pretty substantial um, amount of plant material coming out of just one bud. Due to that, in order to have a really good harvest, it's a good idea to keep it to like 40 or 50 buds on a plant. That's just a rule of thumb. You can go more or less. If you exceed that, expect lower yield per bud, but 40 to 50 is going to give you quite a bit, and they're all going to be really good quality. That's the other thing. If you thin out your plant or prune it or reduce the amount of flowering buds, you're going to have greater quality per fruit because the same amount of energy is going into lesser fruit. So it's going to be sweeter, bigger, juicier, whatnot. So 40 to 50 buds per vine is a pretty good way to do it. You can cut it into a cordons are the terms that are used for the 1 year, or sorry, the 2+ year old wood. And then there's a few different terms for that 1 year wood where your fruit buds are actually going to form. Sometimes they're called whips. Some people just form kind of an arch and it's all going one way. If you've got room, you can do more of a T shape. But you're basically, what you're pruning is you're maintaining the cordons and replacing the whips every so often, the 1 year old wood. That'll help keep it really vigorous, but not get out of control. Again, 40 to 50, kind of a good rule to keep it at. Grapes, as far as time of pruning, we're kind of right on the cusp. Usually late winter, early spring is the best time to do it. Like I mentioned, or maybe I didn't already, grapes can tolerate pretty dry conditions. They're the sort of thing that, depending on what your use is going to be, there are areas that grow grapes commercially that don't even irrigate at all, especially for wine grapes, because they want to concentrate the flavors. So if you're doing, raisins or jellies, syrups, anything that doesn't require a ton of the juice, you can even irrigate them very, very lightly or minimally. If the goal is fresh eating, of course, plan on watering pretty regularly. The amount of support you'll need for grapes will also vary depending on how you're pruning them. Generally, posts with twine or wire can do the trick. It's kind of a minimal cost investment setup. Or you can do it on a trellis or a lattice if you want something that you can kind of just let the grape do its thing. As far as supports, by the way, we have a bunch just outside the greenhouse here. And I'm happy to talk about those more in depth as well. Hey, Emily, how much time do we have?
About 15 minutes.
Okay. Some of the weirder stuff I'll skip over a little more, or just not talk about it in depth. Goji goji berries are kind of somewhere in between a shrub and a vine. You can prune them to be quite shrubby, but if you give them space or you don't prune them, they can be pretty substantial. They can be 20, 30 feet long. They are really cool because they are one of those plants that yield fruit nearly all season long. So they're perfect for just snacking on regularly. You're never really going to get enough at once unless you got a big plant to make a goji berry pie or anything like that if you wanted to, but they're really good for snacking because they're flowering and fruiting nearly constantly throughout the season.
On the pruning of a goji, do you prune it out inside so it gets more sunlight inside? I have a huge one, and every year I've got to.
Yeah, you can. I mean, as far as from a disease pressure standpoint, it doesn't really matter if you do or not. But if you thin it out, yeah, you can get more yield in the interior. Gojis are, yeah, they really don't have too many issues with pest or disease. There's a few things that they can be subjected to, but that's pretty minimal. So gojis are excellent, really easy, really not picky about soil. As long as you've got a decent amount of sun, they're an awesome, basically all season long fruiter. Hardy kiwi, that is a plant you can grow here, believe it or not. It's not the same as the kiwi you'd buy at the grocery store that's, egg size, fuzzy. The kind of kiwi that grows in Utah or more northerly cold climates is more kind of like a big grape and it's smooth, so you can just pop the whole thing in your mouth at once. They're pretty good. They are a vine, so you're going to treat them as such. But unlike grapes, they are the sort of thing that generally needs a little more room in order to fruit heavily. They also take a long time to yield. There can be anywhere from 4 to 9 years before you get a decent harvest post planting. So it's something that I wouldn't expect fruit on right away. Um, Unlike most of these plants as well, kiwis have separate male and female plants, which is pretty unusual in the plant kingdom. So you need a both male and a female in order to produce fruit. Generally, when you buy from a reputable nursery, it's going to be marked as far as what it is, or you'll find them where it's a male and a female in the pot. So make sure you've got both. And they also don't really have any pest disease issues in Utah, by the way. Let's talk about brambles now. And when I say brambles, I'm referring to raspberries, blackberries, boysenberries, marionberries, anything that grows on a cane, essentially. They're all really closely related. Generally, they're all in the genus Rubus. And so you can treat them kind of similarly. Like they'll have the same pest issues, the same disease issues. Pruning varies a little bit depending on what sort of a fruiting type it is, but for like an ever-bearing blackberry and an ever-bearing raspberry, you can treat them really similar. Raspberries and blackberries are primarily, and I didn't bring one up to show, they're divided into, or I did, they're divided into fall-bearing and summer-bearing. So hence the name, it refers to the season of harvest. The most important thing is it tells you when, like how old the wood has to be to fruit. So for example, this is called Fall Gold. It's a really nice raspberry. It's golden. It doesn't ripen up to red, which is kind of fun. It is an ever-bearing or a fall-bearing raspberry. So another way to think of that is this is a primo cane raspberry versus a floricane raspberry. So these will flower and fruit on new wood. So something like this would produce fruit this year if it's got enough energy. You start harvesting fruit usually around August to September, and since it's fruiting on that first year cane, by the way, most canes on raspberries, blackberries usually live 2 to 3 years before they're replaced by new ones. Since it produces fruit on that first year cane, it is the sort of thing that you can prune to the ground every season and still have a successful harvest. That's just one way of doing it. I like it because it's hands off. You get a pretty good amount of yield as long as we don't have a super early fall frost. To contrast that, or floricane raspberries and blackberries produce fruit on wood that has gone through at least one winter. So something like this, if it were a summer-bearing raspberry, nothing would happen this year. It'd just grow and get big, get happy. Next season, around June or July, it would start flowering and fruiting. That's the sort of raspberry that is grown up in Bear Lake, for example. I think they grow candy. Anyone been in Utah for a while? Bear Lake's kind of known for their raspberries. Those are excellent for colder climates where you might have a frost in August or September more likely. So you can't rely on something that's a super late bearer. Those you need to maintain the wood until it's at least a year old, so you're cutting it back every other year. Usually, for summer bearing raspberries, you're not cutting it back completely. You're thinning out maybe half of those old floricanes, again, the 2-year-old canes, so that you can prioritize the primo canes from the previous year that will then bear fruit. Mm-hmm.
And it looks like it's a mix.
Mm.
And so now what?
So if the two are kind of mixed together, that does make it trickier to prune, but you could just do like a great reset and cut it all back, right? And then see what happens the following year. What likely is the case, and I should have mentioned this with the fall bearing raspberries, is the fall bearers produce fruit on that primo cane, and they start from the top and they go down. Once we hit a frost, they stop and they're dormant for the season. They still produce fruit their second year. They pick up where they left off. So you do get an earlier harvest on the 2-year-old fall bears as well. So that might be what's going on. If it's just one species or one variety, there is, you get the older wood that produces fruit where it left off from the previous year, and the new stuff that's fruiting too. So you can treat the fall bears kind of like a summer bear and thin out, around half of those 1-year-old canes in order to have a longer harvest season. But keep in mind that double cropping, it's sometimes called, with fall bears, generally the second crop is smaller, both in quality and in quantity. So it's kind of a trade-off. Top, yeah, top of canes, or you can cut them all the way to the ground. If you have a healthy patch of brambles, you can prune them really, really heavily, and that can kind of help to handle back on things.
I have the same kind of question. I just bought plants that just said raspberries on the back, or blackberries,
Mm.
or marionberries, and they didn't say fall or summer. They were all new babies last spring, but they grew like crazy all summer. So I haven't touched them because I don't know what to do.
Did you get any fruit last year?
Yeah, a little bit on all of them.
Okay, so they're probably going to be fall bearing generally.
Even though they started in July.
If you got fruit, well, if it was a 1-year-old cane, like if you started with almost, it depends on what you're starting with, right? Because even this has some wood at the base. If you already had a decent amount of wood and it sent out new growth and it was fruiting in July, maybe it's a summer bear. But
I just don't know what to do because they're like 12 to 20 feet long and everywhere, and I've been afraid to cut them because I don't know what to do.
like I mentioned, you can just cut them all the way back to the ground as kind of a reset, because that can help you get a handle on things.
Like I tried watching videos and they're all like, it has to be first year if it's this, the second year if it's this, and I'm like, I don't have to.
Okay.
I don't know.
Maybe in your scenario, we'll tackle that more in the Q&A. So I have enough time to go over this extra stuff here. But yeah, I can help you with that for sure.
Is it spring or fall?
Pruning, generally late winter, early spring. So raspberries are kind of divided into fall bearing, summer bearing. Blackberries are as well, but you almost never find summer bearing blackberry. Well, let's refer to them maybe more so as floricane blackberries in Utah, because they almost always experience significant winter damage in our climate, unless you're further south, like St. George area. So blackberries, the fall bearing are the ones you don't really see in Utah. It's almost always summer bearing. With blackberries, you prune them kind of like a summer bearing raspberry, where maybe you control the size for that first year cane. A common way to do is topping it at 6 feet, 4 feet, depending on what type it is. And then those laterals grow, and that's where you're going to get your fruit harvest on the second year. Again, we can talk about that a little bit more in depth for particular scenarios. But blackberries, usually it's a summer bearer, control the size the first year, second year harvest, maybe cut back. Blackberries also have a few different growth habits. Some are erect and don't need support, so they grow totally upright. Some are semi-erect, meaning they're kind of big and arching, and some are trailing. Usually you don't find trailing blackberries in Utah for the risk of winter damage, but you support them and prune them a little differently depending on what type they are. And then let's talk about strawberries if we've got the time. Strawberries are kind of the exception because they're herbaceous, meaning they don't have any woody material. It's all soft tissue. You'll buy them either in a containerized form like this, where it's already got an established root ball, or right now you can even plant bare root strawberries. We've got them right now, bundles of 10. Strawberries are also divided into a couple of different seasons of bearing. So they're perennial, but you've got June bearing, and then ever bearing or day neutral. So with the June bearing, they require days, or really nights, of a certain length. They want them to be short nights in order to produce fruit. For ever bearing or day neutral strawberries, the amount of time, the balance between the light and dark doesn't matter as much, because they've been bred to just fruit pretty continuously. So depending on what your goal is, maybe you want the summer bearing so you can harvest a bunch all at once, get a good batch to make your strawberry jam and whatnot. Or if the goal is more to just snack on it, maybe you do a day neutral and ever bearing form, because then you have a longer harvest season. Strawberries are perennial, but they kind of peter out after a few years. I don't know if anyone else has experienced that. You plant strawberries, get a decent yield. Over time, they produce less and less. So it is the sort of thing that you can replace occasionally, because they kind of tend to peter out. The balance with strawberries between the vegetative and the reproductive is that most strawberries produce runners. You get these long stolons, they're called. You get little plantlets on the ends. If you let your strawberries do that, it's going to focus on vegetative reproduction. You may not get as high of a yield. So if the goal is pretty vigorous fruit production, especially if you don't mind replacing your strawberries occasionally, you would pinch that growth off so that it can focus on flowering and fruiting. That's a pretty common mistake. Or not really a mistake, just a way of doing things is planting them, letting them do their thing. Yield, they spread a ton. Second year, third year, your yield goes down and down each season. So of course, ideally from the get-go, like with the blackberries and raspberries, you know what kind you're getting so that you can, prune it and care for it appropriately. But generally, it's the sort of thing you want to replace occasionally anyway, unfortunately.
Can you replace them by allowing some of those runners to root?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you don't have to buy new ones from a nursery every year necessarily. But if you're letting those runners reproduce, you're also affecting your fruit harvest. So it is a trade-off. Yeah. Yeah, but you can have a successful patch. Keep in mind, with strawberries, they're all, if you're doing it that way, they're all clones of each other. So if you do get some sort of pasture disease issue, it can affect pretty much everything all at once. So replacing it occasionally just to mitigate pests and diseases can also be a good idea. Let's see. Again, I was going to say I'm not going to talk a ton about pest management in this class. It's kind of beyond the scope of it, but prevention is your first step. Pruning, watering, choosing the right plant for the right spot. Then you can, of course, you want to choose the proper varieties. Kind of your next step is using a biological control, meaning whether that's insects that you buy, like ladybugs, lacewings, or something like this. It's a bacteria that affects, that's really good at controlling certain types of fungus. Generally, that's a lot less harmful. It can be more targeted. And then if you have to, you can go to your broad spectrum insecticides and fungicides if needed. If you keep your plant really healthy, you're not going to have too many pest and disease issues, however. Do I have time to talk about some weird fruits? Okay. So there's all the common stuff we've talked about. There are some unusual things as well. Like I mentioned service berries earlier. This is a plant that's primarily grown for ornamental value, but they produce delicious, abundant fruit. They're one of the first trees. I know this looks like a shrub. It's kind of a shrubby tree that produces fruit. You can get a yield, as early as June, depending on the weather. They kind of taste like blueberries mixed with an almond flavor. It's really nice, really underrated. I'm not going to talk about too many of these in depth for the class, but I'll just mention them. So service berries are awesome, super easy to grow. Sand cherries, like I mentioned earlier. This is the smallest native North American cherry in terms of plant size. This thing gets like 2 feet tall, but ironically, it has the biggest fruit. It can be full-size European cherry. They can be a little bit astringent. Don't let that scare you away. When them ripen up all the way, they're really sweet, or they're awesome for fruit leather, jams, jellies, syrups, that kind of stuff. Most other native North American cherries have really, really tiny fruit, like choke cherries, which are also good, but those are trees, so we're not going to talk about them too much. There are some other plants like the Nanking cherry I brought up here. See, gorgeous flower. A lot of people grow these just for the blooms and for the fall color. This also does produce nearly full-size cherry fruit. This one does need another plant nearby, not a separate kind, just another Nanking cherry nearby in order to get a decent yield. These are also super drought tolerant, really easy to grow. They can get 6 or 8 feet tall, so it's a decent sized plant. There are some other interesting ones that we often carry. Golden currants, I mentioned, that's a good native. Buffalo berries, really, really tiny. It's a pretty big plant, but they're delicious as well. Roses, we're surrounded by roses. Rose hips are a great source of vitamin C, and they can taste quite good if you process them properly. My point being, you don't just have to stick with the usual cast. There's all kinds of unusual stuff that you can grow and eat as well. And with that, I think we'll do questions now. That works.